In this video, I'm going to explain the notion of externality in a supply and demand diagram. So first of all, externality refers to a phenomenon in which the actions of buyers and sellers in a given market have a spillover effect to bystanders. Specifically, if the cost of production is not only paid by the producers, we would say this good have a negative externality because the spillover effect is adverse or negative. Example of such goods include cigarettes or gas. Alternatively, if the benefit of consuming the good is not only enjoyed by the consumers who pay the price, but also other people, we would say this good has a positive externality because consuming this good will benefit other people. Examples include vaccine. So now let me talk about negative externalities more specifically using a demand and supply diagram. And I'm going to use the example of cigarettes because clearly smoking imposes some external cost on others. So therefore, cigarettes is a good that has a negative externality. So we started with a standard demand and supply diagram as depicted by the two black lines. So in this diagram, we're going to call this supply function the supply function that reflects the private cost, because the height of the supply function at any given point, it only reflects the cost of producing that cigarettes, but it didn't really reflect the external cost that the smoking behavior imposed on the bystanders. So in this case, the private supply and demand would determine an equilibrium point. In this case, I'm going to call this level QE. So this would be the equilibrium quantity in a market in which the producers of cigarettes does not really care about the external cost that smoking imposed on the bystanders. And this quantity, QE, will be inefficient once we do take those external costs into consideration. Because at this level, when the market is producing QE units of cigarettes, if you look at this level, the benefit of consuming cigarettes is depicted by the height of this green dotted line. However, the social cost of producing that very cigarette, which is depicted by this higher supply curve, what we call the S social. It reflects the supply curve that reflect the social cost. And social cost, by definition, is private cost plus external cost. So in this case, since clearly the social cost of producing that cigarettes is higher than the benefit of consuming that cigarettes, when cost is greater than the benefit, that means that the market really should produce a lesser amount. So therefore, QE will be inefficient. So what is the efficient level of production in this case after we take the negative externality into account? So as mentioned before, this second supply function, what I call S social. So this is the supply function that truly reflects the cost of producing cigarettes on everybody in this economy. Therefore, the intersection of this supply function with the demand function will determine the truly efficient level of production. In this case, I'm going to call this level QS, which stands for the so-called socially optimal quantity, because this level is determined by the demand function and the supply function that reflect the social cost of producing cigarettes. So another observation from this graph is, since the social supply curve is higher than the private supply curve, Therefore, that means the socially optimal level, QS, will be lower than the equilibrium quantity determined by the free market, QE. So as such, it means that the free market would tend to produce more than the efficient level, which is what we call the socially optimal level of production. So since the market in this case overproduced or it produced too many cigarettes than what a socially optimal quantity indicates, what should the government do in order to make the quantity of production go back to the socially optimal level? Put it differently, what could a government do in order to reduce the production level from QE to QS? Since the policy goal here is to reducing production, so one plausible way of doing so is by using a tax. So in this case, we call this tax a corrective tax. And if the tax amount is exactly the amount of externality, which is the gap between the social supply and the private supply, then the supply function after imposing this tax would be exactly the social supply function as indicated by the blue line on this diagram. So after imposing this tax on the producers, the supply function after the tax will be exactly aligned with the social supply function. So that given this after-tax supply function, the new market equilibrium will changes from QE to QS. So this is in practice how government could what we call internalize a negative externality. Now, let's move on to a diagram explaining the notion of a positive externality. So the example I'm going to use is face mask. So clearly, face mask is a good that has a positive externality because wearing a face mask, especially today, will not only protect yourself from the coronavirus, but it will also help others from being infected. So in this case, since the private benefit of consuming face mask is different from the social benefit of consuming face mask. So instead of having two supply function, we're going to have two demand. So one reflect the private benefit and the higher demand curve, which reflect the social benefit of consuming face mask. And by the way, social benefit is defined as the private benefits plus the external benefit. So in this case, similarly as before, the intersection of the private supply and the demand function that reflect the private benefit would determine the market equilibrium QE. However, this QE will be inefficient because the efficient level of face mask is determined by the social demand function and the private supply function, which is what we call QS. And in this case, when this good has a positive externality, we find QE is actually less than QS, which means that the market in this case is underproduced. It didn't produce enough face masks as the society needed. And this is because when we draw the private demand and supply function, it didn't really account for the external benefit from wearing face mask. And once we do take those external benefit into account, the society really should have produced more face mask. And in this case, we encourage the market to produce more face mask. Instead of using a tax, the government should use a subsidy to incentivize consumers to buy more face mask. So the way that a subsidy works is for any consumer who's willing to buy a face mask, the government would, for example, give them a $1 subsidy for every face mask that they buy. And once such a subsidy is imposed, then the demand function of face mask would shift up by exactly $1. And if the size of the subsidy exactly equals to the size of the external benefit, then the demand function after having the subsidy would be exactly the same as the social demand function, this blue line right here, so that the new market equilibrium quantity will change from QE to QS. So this is in practice how the government could internalize a positive externality by using a subsidy. In the next video, I'm going to talk a bit more details about different ways in which the government could regulate externality.